On November 7, 1943, the airfield at Knarpik sat 30 miles behind the German front lines, occupied, guarded, and operational. That afternoon, a massive Republic P-47 Thunderbolt of the United States Army Air Forces rolled onto its grass runway full of fuel, its guns still loaded, and its pilot completely lost. Second Lieutenant William E. Roach of the 358th Fighter Squadron had flown south across the Channel that day on an escort mission over the Normandy coast. Somewhere in the grey overcast of a November afternoon, he had turned himself around 180 degrees without knowing it, believing he was over southern England approaching a friendly airfield. He set the aircraft down because his low fuel state demanded it, stepping out of the cockpit and straight into the hands of a German ground crew who had been watching the final approach with their mouths open. Roach spent the rest of the war in captivity, but his intact aircraft carrying the squadron code YFU and nicknamed Beetle sat untouched on the Luftwaffe runway with its 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns still armed and its engine ticking as it cooled in the winter air. 3 days later, a priority message from the German command reached the primary aviation testing center at Rechlin, ordering them to send someone to evaluate and ferry the captured machine. The man they sent was Hans-Werner Lersche, a university-trained aeronautical engineer and the Luftwaffe's principal test pilot for captured Allied aircraft. By November of 1943, Lersch had flown more than 125 different German and foreign aircraft types, making him uniquely qualified to evaluate a machine whose engineering decisions could not always be inferred from the outside. A pure test pilot without technical training could only describe what an aircraft felt like to fly, but an engineer who could also fly could describe exactly what the aircraft was doing and why. This distinction mattered immensely when Lersch climbed the wing route and lowered himself into Beetle's cockpit on November 10th, because he did not simply record that the cockpit was complex. He identified the specific subsystems that produced that complexity and immediately connected each one to its precise engineering function. What he found in that cockpit stayed with him for decades, revealing a human factors philosophy and a set of design assumptions that had absolutely no counterpart in anything the Luftwaffe's testing center had previously evaluated. To understand why the American cockpit was so jarring to an experienced German evaluator, one must look at where German fighter design philosophy had been heading by late 1943. The standard Luftwaffe frontline fighters, like the Messerschmitt, Bf-109G, and the Focke-Wulf 190, had progressively simplified their engine management to reduce pilot workload under extreme combat stress. The Focke-Wulf 190 carried this to the absolute limit with the Commando Gerät, a mechanical analog computer that automatically coordinated throttle position, propeller pitch, mixture ratio, supercharger boost, and cooling flaps from a single power lever. The German philosophy was that a pilot under fire could not reliably manage multiple interdependent variables simultaneously, so the mechanical system made the optimal decisions automatically. Republic Aviation and Pratt & Whitney had made the exact opposite choice for the Thunderbolt, operating on the philosophy that a pilot who thoroughly understood the mechanics could extract a level of performance from the aircraft that automation could never anticipate. Instead of a single centralized computer, they gave the pilot direct manual authority over the massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine, with dedicated gauges tracking each variable and individual levers for every single adjustment. This approach produced a cockpit layered in a way that rewarded patient systematic study, but severely punished impatience or panic. The instrument panel held approximately 30 separate gauges, warning lights, and indicators, with every switch, placard, and label written entirely in English. The core of this internal complexity was rooted in the management of the aircraft's revolutionary propulsion system. The double-row radial engine breathed through a massive General Electric turbo-supercharger mounted low in the rear fuselage behind the cockpit, fed by long exhaust ducts running the full length of the aircraft. To prevent catastrophic detonation or structural damage, the pilot had to manually manage the turbo wastegate to hold manifold pressure within strict limits at any given throttle setting. Simultaneously, the pilot had to continuously adjust the intercooler shutters to regulate the temperature of the compressed air, keeping it cool enough to maintain engine power but open enough to avoid carburetor icing at high altitudes. Beyond the engine controls, the pilot faced a demanding operational workload across all secondary systems. At maximum war emergency power, the pilot had to manually activate and time a temporary water methanol anti-detonation injection system. The electrical constant-speed propeller required a separate RPM lever that had to be carefully coordinated during combat power changes to prevent the propeller from overspeeding or lugging. Furthermore, the fuel system fed from multiple internal wing and fuselage tanks, requiring the pilot to actively switch between selectors on a strict schedule to prevent dangerous center of gravity shifts during violent combat maneuvering, while also managing external drop tanks and activating electrical gun heaters before reaching freezing high altitudes. Lerche methodically worked through these systems without a manual, testing the unfamiliar hydraulic flap equalization mechanism at a safe altitude before attempting his ferry flight to verify how it maintained symmetric deployment under varying pressures. His subsequent systematic flight evaluation at Rechlin translated raw combat impressions into precise measured parameters that shaped how German pilots trained to fight the new threat. He concluded that at sea level, the heavy 14,000-pound Thunderbolt reached only 500 kilometers per hour, making it sluggish and entirely unsuited for close-range turning combat against the lighter German types. However, at 9,000 meters, the exhaust-driven turbo maintained sea-level charge density, allowing the P-47 to hit a blistering 640 kilometers per hour in level flight and completely dominate German interceptors, whose mechanical superchargers were choking in the thin atmosphere. While the Luftwaffe used Lerche's data to build a tactical doctrine, advising their pilots to force the engagement to low altitude and avoid high-altitude diving fights, the captured cockpit revealed an even deeper truth about the industrial scale of the enemy. A combat-ready panel carrying 30 highly calibrated instruments with red and green limit markings indicated an American manufacturing system capable of producing high-tolerance components by the thousands. This realization grew when a second intact P-47 arrived in May 1944, after another pilot became disoriented, allowing the mobile evaluation unit Zirkus Rosarius to tour frontline bases. German aces could walk around the massive engine cowl and realize that the United States wasn't just flying an experimental prototype, but deploying hundreds of these complex, highly standardized machines, multiple times a week. Ultimately, the strategic air war shifted faster than the Luftwaffe could adapt to Lerche's technical findings. By early 1944, the Merlin-powered P-51 Mustang arrived to take over long-range bomber escort duties to Berlin, forcing the Thunderbolt down into a low-altitude ground attack role across occupied Europe. In this new, low-level arena, the exact engineering choices Lerche had meticulously documented inside Beetle's cockpit, the heavy structural frames, robust dual-row cooling, and a massive radial engine that could take direct flak hits and run smoothly without oil pressure, transformed the P-47 into the most devastating ground-strafing platform of the war. Lerche's wartime logs, preserved as pure engineering measurements free from post-war reputational defense, remain an unencumbered historical testimony to an American aircraft so robustly built that after sitting for 3 days in the winter cold of a hostile runway, a foreign test pilot could climb inside, decipher the English controls, and watch the engine roar flawlessly to life.